Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the state of North Carolina's Republican primary for the Senate elections, which are going to be held a week from today on May 17th, coinciding with the Pennsylvania primaries. So originally they were supposed to be held back in March, but the North Carolina Supreme Court pushed it up to May. So now the primary will be happening on the same day as the Pennsylvania Senate primaries. Now, if we go down to the polling for this race, there was a dramatic shift in about March of 2022. And that, of course, was when Donald Trump endorsed Congressman Ted Budd. Prior to that, former Republican Governor Pat McCrory had a pretty solid lead against any of the contenders in the field. And it makes sense. He's one of the most widely known names in North Carolina Republican politics, being a former governor and a former mayor of Charlotte. So it makes sense that Republicans would pick him. Now, something about primaries that's interesting is normally in these polls, and I guess you could say in general election polls early on, is people tend to support the person that they know. This is particularly significant in primaries. Many North Carolina voters already know Pat McCrory, and thus, in the beginning, were inclined to support him. Once Ted Budd really got his name out there and, of course, got the attention of Donald Trump, that's when things really started to change for him. There were a couple polls where he was somewhat close to Pat McCrory. There's one where he was down by 5 in early January 2022, down by 3. But then once he got the endorsement of Donald Trump, it wasn't even a competition anymore. And Ted Budd, on average, according to RCP, is leading by 15.2%, which means at this rate, it's likely that he's able to hold off a runoff election in the state of North Carolina, possibly. He might be able to hold off a runoff, and if a runoff does happen, then the final vote for the Republican nominee will take place in July. But as of right now, Ted Budd is surging ever since his Trump endorsement. Now, previously, again, as we said, Pat McCrory nearing almost 50% of support early on in the Republican primary, slowly started to dip as Ted Budd and Mark Walker made their presences more known, although Mark Walker really never got that far. He's also he's a former congressman. He never really pulled above 20%, and at this point really isn't a viable candidate for the nomination. But as the campaign went on, a lot of mudslinging in this campaign. Pat McCrory is actually running to the left of Ted Budd being the Trump-endorsed candidate. Pat McCrory isn't running as anti-Trump, but he's tried to frame Ted Budd as a Russian sympathizer, an insurrectionist and all this, running these kind of scary ads on TV to scare Republican primary voters. But I think that's quite an odd strategy considering the Republican base doesn't really like that sort of messaging to begin with, and it only makes Ted Budd look like more of an authentic candidate with these sort of slanders that you would expect from a Democrat. So as a result, Ted Budd has been doing exceptionally well in the polling. In the latest poll, nearing 50%. Now, all he needs is 50% to avoid a runoff election, and this nomination is his on May 17th. And I won't have a final prediction on the margins for this primary until we get a lot closer to primary day. I might put all my May 17th primary predictions into one long video the day before the primaries. That way I can kind of solidify my final predictions for these primaries there. But if we take a look back at North Carolina in 2020, it was one of the closer states in the general election. Donald Trump won the state by 1.3%. North Carolina is one of those states that Democrats always try to flip and are very unsuccessful in doing so, albeit the only really exception to that is the statewide offices like governor, attorney general. But in terms of federal races, a Democrat hasn't won a federal election in North Carolina since 2008, which was a landslide for Democrats all across the country, turning a lot of traditional Republican strongholds like Virginia, like Colorado, into blue states. But in North Carolina, that was kind of averted. And one of the reasons for that, even today with North Carolina still being a red state, is the fact that North Carolina is more rural. Its population is more rural than places like Virginia and Colorado. And also that the rural areas haven't been maxed out for Republicans yet. You saw trends in southeastern North Carolina and northeastern North Carolina with trends to the right. And this was a year where Democrats won the popular vote by 5 points, albeit the suburbs continued to trend a lot more Democratic. Mecklenburg County, which is home of Charlotte, trended nearly 6 points to the left. Wake County, home of Raleigh, North Carolina, trended 6 points left. So on and so forth. So while you had city and suburban counties trending to the left generally, you still had enough movement in these rural areas to stave off the Democrats actually flipping the state. Now going into 2022, which is expected to be a good year for Republicans as of right now, I don't really see North Carolina being incredibly competitive on the general election level. If we just look at the general election polls real quick and scroll all the way down, Ted Budd being the likely nominee here, we'll look at these. There's not a single poll where Cheri Beasley is ahead or even tied with Ted Budd. Now, looking at these polls, it's important to note that in the state of North Carolina, Democrats tend to be overpolled. So as a result, polls in North Carolina always tend to swing to the left relative to the actual result. One example of this is North Carolina's Senate race back in the 2020 election. Donald Trump won the state of North Carolina by 1.3, but Thom Tillis, the incumbent senator, won the state of North Carolina by nearly 2 points at 1.8%. Now, in both of these races, the Senate race and the presidential race, the Democrats were polling ahead. This was the case in 2016. Polls in North Carolina tend to always sample Democrats, and as a result, the actual election returns tend to favor Republicans by a few points or so, normally pushing them over the edge and having them win these statewide races. The fact that Cheri Beasley is failing to lead in a single poll or even tie is really bad news for the Democrats' chances to win this seat. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think North Carolina is going to be incredibly competitive, despite the fact that Donald Trump only won the state by 1.3%. This is going to be an off-year election with heightened Republican turnout. North Carolina still didn't flip. It was still a red state, so the fact that 2022 is going to be a redder year than 2020 just signifies how difficult it would be for Democrats to actually be able to pick up a Senate seat here. And honestly, if I was a Democrat, I wouldn't be spending a whole lot of money in the state of North Carolina. I'd focus on the more winnable Senate races. But again, if we take a look at, first we'll take a look at Ted Budd. Ted Budd is a relatively new congressman. He's only been in Congress since 2016. His current district is North Carolina's 13th. It's a safe Republican district wedged in between Greensboro and Raleigh. He has a fairly conservative record. I think he's part of the House Freedom Caucus, so that probably caught Trump's attention. Ultimately, the Trump endorsement propelled him ahead in the nomination here against Pat McCrory, who, like I said earlier, is running a much more moderate to centrist campaign in a Republican primary, which isn't really good political strategy considering that, like I said, a lot of the ads he's running you'd expect from a Democratic opponent and not someone in the Republican primary. Now, if we look at Pat McCrory, there's a really interesting electoral history here because Pat McCrory was the mayor of Charlotte, which is a very Democratic city in North Carolina, but used to vote for Republican mayors. And even some of the recent mayoral elections, even going back as recent as like 2015, Republicans are getting well over 40% of the vote in a city you think would be a safe blue city. When you look at precinct maps, Charlotte's a very, very blue city. But nonetheless, it does get close in those very off-year elections, I assume because of turnout or perhaps because the Republicans are running much more moderate campaigns. Pat McCrory was a socially liberal mayor of Charlotte. He was a business-friendly Republican, but he was also very liberal on social issues, and that made him a pretty popular mayor in the city. Now, going into 2008, he ran for governor. He ultimately lost, but he only lost by 3.5 points. And the reason I say only is because he did very poorly in eastern North Carolina, all of these rural counties here. In some cases, these counties going bluer than they did for Barack Obama. Yet in Mecklenburg County, home of Charlotte, he almost won this county, which if we go back to 2020, for instance, is a county that Donald Trump only got 31.6% of the votes. So that just goes to show you the huge suburban shifts in North Carolina, specifically in the Charlotte area. But despite these huge losses in rural North Carolina, Pat McCrory was only 3.5 points away from winning the governorship purely because he was overperforming in places like Charlotte and Raleigh. If we fast forward to 2012, Pat McCrory was able to massively overperform Mitt Romney in the state. Mitt Romney only won North Carolina by about 2 points or so. And in places like Wake County, for instance, he lost by 10. Charlotte, he lost by 22. Pat McCrory was able to win both of these counties by narrow margins. The fact that he won Mecklenburg County itself is extremely impressive, even though he's a former mayor and ran a pretty moderate campaign in North Carolina, which is one of the reasons why he ended up losing in 2016, because Pat McCrory campaigned on a much more moderate message. I believe he was pro-choice. He was much more liberal on social issues. He mostly was a Republican who focused on economic issues, more of a business-oriented Republican. And as time went on, he gradually got a lot more conservative until, of course, you have in 2016 HB2, which was the infamous bathroom bill that led to a lot of companies threatening to leave the state. and of course his poll numbers tanking to abysmally low numbers. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons cited as to why Pat McCrory lost his re-election. He lost it narrowly, 0.2%, but he still lost, and he did extremely poorly in the suburbs, particularly Mecklenburg County, which he only got 34.2% of the vote, although I will note he actually did overperform Donald Trump in the county. So despite all of this, he still overperformed Donald Trump in a extremely liberal part of the state. Now, he underperformed Trump everywhere else, though, particularly in rural counties and just general suburban counties across the state. He did slightly worse than Donald Trump, and Roy Cooper, his opponent, did slightly better, ultimately leading to him underperforming by several points over Donald Trump, who got nearly 50% of the vote in the state to Hillary's 46.2. Now, I think it's evident looking at some of the polling for the Senate race here that Pat McCrory would have been a worse nominee, or would be a worse nominee. The nomination isn't over, but I mean, if you look at the Republican primary polls, it's essentially over. And of course, I'm not really making a video covering the Democratic primary because Sherry Beasley is going to win very easily. There's literally almost no opposition. All of her opposition essentially dropped out of the race, so there's no really reason to cover that primary. Going back down here, though, Pat McCrory is underperforming Ted Budd significantly against Sherry Beasley. In fact, he's the only candidate that loses to her, 43-41 in the latest poll. This was the same Emerson College poll that had Ted Budd up 50-43 against Sherry Beasley. And I suspect there's a decent amount of Republicans that refuse to back either candidate and just remained in the undecided column, whereas Ted Budd has less undecideds in his most recent poll. He's a safer option for the Republicans to pick. He has Trump's blessing. Trump is very popular among the Republican base in North Carolina, so it makes sense. And I really think Pat McCrory ruined his future political career in the Republican Party, running these sort of negative ads to the left of Ted Budd, attacking somebody that is Trump endorsed. And ultimately, I don't really see Pat McCrory going anywhere in North Carolina politics. He lost a state that Donald Trump won by 3.5 points. And ultimately, he seems to be a liability for the GOP when it comes to electoral prospects. Now, if he was the nominee, I would still have him as the favorite to win the general election, but it probably would be a closer race. Whereas with Ted Budd, you could easily see the margin being 6 or 7 points. Pat McCrory, it would probably be something around 4.5. So Ted Budd really is the safer nominee for the Republicans at this point. And ultimately going forward, he'll likely be a senator to represent the Trump America First wing of the Republican Party, as opposed to McCrory, who would probably represent more of the establishment Republican wing of the party. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.